Mary's children. So, because she has had a wide impact on training many, many people in CBPR, nationally and internationally, has been doing their work also in South Africa recently, but in other countries as well. And so she brings, I think, a really important strategic direction of CBPR, which is exactly what today is about. She's done some major policy case study work funded by the Kellogg Foundation and then funded by the California Endowment to look across the country and say, what is the best practices around CBPR and policy change? And I think that that's kind of the breadth that she'll bring to this experience today. She has many other accolades, but I'm not going to go into them. Nile Malloy is her partner today, who comes from the Northern California Community for a Better Environment. He's program director there. But real focus on environmental change, on land use issues, on climate programs, on issues that affect communities, disenfranchised communities, especially poor, vulnerable communities, have more impact in these climate issues and environmental contaminations. And so that's what he's bringing. He's interested in kind of this idea of social entrepreneurship, the idea that communities themselves can do the work, and the idea that people can address their own conditions and problems that they're facing. He's taught and lectured at the New College in California. Actually, he's a high school teacher earlier on in his previous life. So the kind of involvement and engagement of these has been part of his focus as well. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for your
Thank you, and I'm just thrilled. I guess I should have a mic because my this isn't what it used to be. Is this on?
Yeah, I think you just have the chart.
What? I have no technological ability. Okay, we're on. I was just going to say, Nina referred to me as her mentor. She was my mentor before she even came into the program, the early work she'd done on ESL. We were just so delighted to get her, and then our friendship has continued over decades. Nile Malloy, I know mostly through his work with CBE, and when Nina mentioned our looking at 16 of the top cases around the country of CBPR that had actually impacted on the policy level, one of CBE's projects was among them. In fact, it was one of the top 2 or 3. So I'm really glad to be able to learn from you more today, Nile. And just want to say quickly, a quick note about this week that we're in. We started out watching as someone said, the dagger in the heart of the Civil Rights Act. Hugely, hugely important for all of us and for the country in terms of what that means and the fights that will be ahead. Then we had a wonderful gay marriage success, although only for one state. And now we are, of course, facing the imminent end of Nelson Mandela. And I do want to say, I always feel badly for younger people in the respect that for people old enough, like myself, we grew up with Martin Luther King, with Rosa Parks, with Cesar Chavez. We had lots of heroes. Nelson Mandela is one of the only heroes that I think crosses all the generations here today. So in CBPR, we always talk about context, and I just wanted to put out that we all have these things in the back of our mind and to the front and in the front of our mind as well. So with that as an introduction, I do want to thank Nina and Juliana and the other members of the planning committee. This has been a wonderful event. I know how hard they work putting it together. And I was very pleased to be asked to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is this coming together of CBPR policy and then getting to social change. As you talked about earlier in the week, one of the key principles of CBPR is that you balance research and action. You don't walk away when the research is done. And that is absolutely essential, in part if we're going to break down the distrust of outside researchers or even inside researchers, given the experiences communities have had for decades and the memory of Tuskegee and everything else that has gone on. I was meeting with the Reverend Denny Buford at Mount Temple Baptist Church in Oakland a few months ago, and he made this comment: researchers are the real undocumented workers. They come in, steal our data, go away and do nothing, leave nothing behind, don't come back. So he now has organized an Open from the Ground Up project to which a few researchers are invited, but we know our place, and it is really very much community driven. Well, action, of course, can take many forms. Why focus on policy? This quote from Nick Freudenberg, I think, sums it up well, because it does provide an intermediate level. It transcends the limitations of working on individual and community change, and it offers some more immediate, although they may not seem like immediate, health payoffs than the more difficult and distal structural changes that may take decades. We need to see some change before we get to the grand prize, and that is what policy level change allows. It's also very consistent with other CVPR principles that you talked about this week, the co-learning, the empowerment, the sustainability, and creating opportunities not only for community partners, some of them need very little or no training in this area, and are, you know, miles ahead of us in terms of things like strategic planning, negotiation, things like policy advocacy, where academics often and health department, you know, some of us are really not coming to the table nearly as skilled in these areas as our community partners. So we all have something to learn from each other, and we learn together through this process. The other thing I like about CVPR is that it attends certainly to distributive justice, and that's something that Niles and CBE have done beautifully, making sure there's fair distribution of exposure, not only to environmental and social hazards to the extent that there are things like pollution, and until we figure out a way to get rid of them, at least there has to be fair distribution, but also to the resources for living, things like access to grocery stores and to parks that are safe and sidewalks and so forth. So that's the distributive justice. But what CVPR also gets to and takes very seriously is procedural justice, which I like to refer to as just getting a place at the policy table and staying at the table to help make the decisions that affect your life and the life of your community. Some of you heard Margaret Gordon the first day of this institute, and she is a classic example of somebody who has taken very seriously procedural justice, both in her own lives and in the life of her community. Well, some of you have heard this figure. I'm glad we had a much healthier breakfast today, but they do say that sausages are like, well, the laws are like sausages, you shouldn't watch them being made. In CVPR, we not only need to watch, we need to be part of that process. We need to get our hands dirty if we're going to get the kind of sustainable change very often that we hope to see. And I think John Kingdon gave us what is perhaps the easiest model of the policymaking process. He said, first, we have to concern ourselves with the problem stream. How do we convince policymakers that a problem exists in the first place? And then secondly, the policy stream, coming up with feasible, politically attractive solutions. And remember, we're living in a time when politically attractive means it doesn't cost anything, or ideally it saves money, or at minimum it's cost effective, but you show us that this is not going to take a bite out of our wallet, and that's a tough thing to do. And then finally, the political stream, negotiating the politics to get our project, or our policy rather, approved over that of those with which it's in competition. He also talks about the window of opportunity that opens when you have favorable events in all of these areas. So the policy stream, the high-profile event, and I know there was one in Southern California where a law governing exposure to toxic pollutants was open for revisiting, and CBE jumped right in there, and they got a major change. So that's a high-profile event in that's the policy stream. I'm getting ahead of myself. New ruling, your proposal suddenly becomes viable. The problem stream, is there a high-profile event? Is there something you can point to that just happened? The Richmond fire is a good example. Good time to go for policy change. And then the political stream, are there new allies? There was talk yesterday in the Chinatown example of the mayor of San Francisco, the first Chinese mayor, and some very strong advocates on city council, on the board of supervisors. That was an important thing, making change more likely. The stages in the policy process are also typically talked about in terms of going through these steps, but I did put an asterisk there. It's, as you know, not a linear process. There's a lot of back and forth, and I'm going to use these steps, knowing that there's back and forth, to go through 3 case studies, and one of which I will, and then I'll just briefly, for people, was everybody here yesterday?
Yeah.
Anybody not here yesterday? Okay, 1 or 2 people. I'll spend like 2 minutes on the update on the Chinatown project, just to show how that got to policy. But 3 other examples, and I put a particular circle here around monitoring enforcement, because that's where I think we unfortunately really fall down, is that we have our victory, we celebrate, we hopefully evaluate the work we've done in getting our CBPR to help impact on the policy level, but if we don't monitor enforcement, nothing may be done. And so that is something else we need to look to. Truth in advertising, I do have to make the point before giving these case studies that it is tough to separate out the role that CBPR played versus that of other factors, other background, contextual factors that are also at play. I put this quote here about most policy involving numerous players, numerous policy levers that get hit by different people, different groups, contextual factors that can make all the difference. So what we're really doing is trying to analyze contributions and connections. We're not trying to claim attribution, but rather contribution. And I think that's important, because if we take too much credit for CBPR, even if we know that CBE and its partners had a big role to play, or the Chinatown project had a big role to play, if we take too big a role, we're going to be offending the people that need to be our allies, and we're not telling the whole story. Okay, with that, I'm going to start and spend the most time on a policy project that goes back, a CBPR project that goes back, I believe now 16, 17 years, is still in operation, and that, for my money, is the best example in a very detailed way of how a community-based organization, in this case West Harlem Environmental Action, went to academic partners at Columbia University about their concern and began what is now, I think, a 13, 14-year partnership, still going strong, only with the funding now coming from NIH and other sources directly to the community partners. So it's a very lovely example. This started because Peggy Shepard and her colleagues at WEAC realized and really believed that the very high rates of asthma in their children, and you can see the brown areas on this New York City map, their asthma rates were some of the highest in the nation. They were certainly the highest in New York City. And they realized there is undoubtedly a connection between that and the fact that northern Manhattan, the area where Harlem is located, is home to 7 out of the 8 diesel bus depots housing all the deep buses in New York City. That's a lot of buses. All the 650 Port Authority buses were there. At the time, there were 760,000 residents, mostly African American and Latino. That's up to 1.5 million people being exposed to this immense amount of pollution. They came up with goals of a partnership, one of them of most interest to the academic partner, and that was studying the relationship between these environmental exposures in the community and environmental health outcomes, and then the one of equal importance to WEAC, translating findings into policy to create equity in environmental decision-making and environmental protection. I just think that is beautifully said. Well, they started out by hiring and training a group of, I think it's 40 each summer for several years, but a group of youth, actually this was 17 youth the first time around, but the youth interns were trained to do things like GIS mapping and other research while they studied environmental health and environmental justice. So this is a map that young people actually drew, showing where the asthma hospitalization rates in kids were highest and where that was in relation to depots and a variety of other polluting facilities. They also, and this I don't know how you do with IRBs, the youth would strap backpack air monitors on and they would stand on these busy street corners for 5 8-hour days and collect data on their exposure to pollution. So I need to talk to them about that IRB business. But anyway, it's lucky they got permission to do the study, because this is what they found, that the EPA standard, as you see, is fairly low in terms of exposure to fine particulate matter. And when they looked at various hotspots, some of which were much less serious than others, the exposure in some of these hotspots was 5 times the EPA average. And the variations, of course, did relate to differences in local exposure, local diesel sources, like a bus depot and so forth. EPA didn't believe the study and said, well, this was done by kids, so we're going to replicate it. Found almost the exact same results. And they have since then cited this study. You continue to see Kenny et al. 2000 in all these contemporary studies on environmental pollution, because this is considered one of the classic studies. They had EPA eating out of their hands as a result of having done this work and spurring the EPA to then get off the dime, they used to say. Now it'd be off the $5 bill, I suspect. Anyway, going backwards. So they did the data collection. Then you've got to set the agenda and create awareness. And I like this line by Kingdom, that agenda is the list of issue areas to which government officials are paying attention. You may have an important issue, but if they're not paying attention, it's not an issue. So getting on the agenda is important. And and their partnership was just masterful at this. So they first put up 75 bus shelter ads, and this is the picture on the ad, and their tagline is, if you live uptown, breathe at your own risk. Really very effective messaging. They held an alternative fuel summit. They held a lot of public testimony, did a lot of briefings of officials, press conferences, and something I love, toxic and treasure tours. How many of you have seen or been on a toxic tour? Okay, good number of people. Anybody been on a toxic and treasure tour? Nobody. We forget that when we're showing policymakers something like Harlem or Bayview Hunters Point or any other area, we need to point out the assets in this community. And in Harlem, it is not hard. And if the policymakers are looking and say, okay, here's this huge bus depot that badly pollutes the neighborhood, and here's the Apollo Theater, and think how important that is, the history of jazz in this country. You remind them this is not a throwaway neighborhood. No neighborhood, no community is throwaway anyway, but remind them of the treasures your community possesses. They also created awareness online. They've done a wonderful job. Their weact.org website is one of the best I know, so be sure to visit it often. They also have their own community newsletter, and they put this article in, and if you're not an Elvis fan, I don't know if I spelled choked right, but all choked up, all shook up. Anyway, explain in a way that the community folks could follow easily the relationship between diesel exposure from the buses and the trucks and all, and adolescent health in Harlem. I like this line by Dennis Raphael. He says, if an article appears in Social Science and Medicine, but nobody reads it, doesn't exist. And we really need to pay attention to that. We academics, we from the health department, we need to publish, partly to get the word out about best practices to our professionals, partly, frankly, to get tenure and not lose our jobs. But if that's the only place our results appear, we're not doing our jobs, certainly not in CDPR. Another thing that WEAC did well and that we'll be playing around with later this afternoon is something called power mapping, where you, and you have this in your booklet, it's one of the handouts, but you list out what your policy objective is, and there may be more than one. For each policy objective, you list, okay, who are our key supporters? Who are the undecided people or organizations that might be really important to win over, and who are the opposition? And as you can see, the circles are the targets that have the power to make change. The squares are the players that are either most affected by the policy or have the potential to influence the situation. And the size, you can change the size around to show the relative amount of power and so forth. But it's a really good exercise, and I've used it with community groups and have seen other groups use it. WEAC certainly has made use of this in their work with very good effectiveness. The other thing they've done very well is have very clear policy goals. You don't want to talk about the results of your finding and then the newspaper or somebody else says, okay, and what should we do? Well, we ought to make things better. We got to do right by that's not it. We have had these very clear goals. Getting the government to buy 300 natural gas buses, getting the largest depot converted to natural gas, and so forth. And they had very clear policy targets. The head of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the governor, the State Legislative Oversight Committee. So really doing your homework. Who has the power to make change? It doesn't help to do a demonstration in front of a local organization if it's part of a chain and has no ability to affect policy change for that corporation. The other thing we acted really well was media advocacy. And my friend Larry Wallach defined this years ago as the strategic use of mass media to advance a public policy agenda or the agenda or concern of a community. And both he and Lori Dorfman point out that we make a big mistake when we do our CBPR, we've got our data, and then we run to the press. That's the access. You know, we run to get a journalist to cover the story. And what they say is we're doing it just backwards. We need an overall strategy. It may be that calling in the media is the worst thing we can do. We're going to anger the very people that we need to win over. So is a media strategy appropriate? If it is, what's the message? Again, you can't just go in with a garbled message or without having a couple of sound bites that you know will be picked up. And then finally, when all of that is clear, then you contact the journalist or your person that's going to be able to put you in touch with the right person in the media. The other thing I always like to stress is the importance of timing. Community organizers from Saul Alinsky on down have always said timing is everything. We ACT had a real knack for this. This is Peggy Shepard on my fake TV. I'm finding this image and doing this little thing. But she was one who would be very good about saying, okay, how can we time the release of our findings so that they coincide with something going on, something important like an anniversary, the first anniversary of the Chevron fire. Let's go forward with our latest study and our latest community demand and so forth. Even taking advantage of things that come along and just happen to coincide with another relevant event. Peggy was asked to be on a TV news show, and it happened to be Valentine's Day, so she brought with her this 4-by-8-foot giant red heart and said, I want to present this to the EPA because they just gave in to our community's request. It was actually a demand, but they gave in to our request to do air monitoring, to put permanent air monitors in hot spots around Harlem and around the rest of the country, and we are so proud of EPA. Well, part of the multi-site case study analysis that I was doing on these various wonderful projects was calling policymakers. So I called the head of the EPA in Washington, in New York, and said, what can you tell me about We ACT and have they influenced your decision-making on this particular issue? And they said, when Peggy Shepard went on TV and gave us that heart, nobody ever thinks of a government agency. This was huge. We would do anything for Peggy Shepard at that point, and now it changed because they subsequently, Nene always reminds me, no permanent friends, no permanent allies, and EPA has gone from being a friend to an ally back and forth. But the fact is, when they had an opportunity, they thanked the organization that had done the right thing, and that made a difference. The other thing that We ACT and the We ACT partnership does well is think about what are the likely counter arguments we're going to hear from, for example, a Metropolitan Transit Authority. They're going to say having all these bus depots in Harlem is a legitimate business necessity. Well, we're going to say if it's unacceptable downtown, it's unacceptable uptown. Makes the point, good media soundbite. And what about construction of depots at other sites being unrealistic? Double standard is racism. No question about it. This is environmental racism. So they had their answers ready. And that's another thing we often forget to do. I wanted to mention briefly the academic partner's role in policy and advocacy. Some of us like to be very active long after the funding has run out. I mean, Charlotte and I continue, and Pam would run down to City Hall or run down anytime there's a confrontation with a Chinatown restaurant. We want to be there. We want to show that it's not just local Chinese who are concerned about this. But a lot of academics are a little more standoffish, and yet even in this case, the academic who was the primary academic was a epidemiologist, and he said, I participate at hearings and meetings with policymakers when it's important for me to be there. I mostly present findings at scientific meetings because I think that's the most important thing I can do, and I spread the word in different settings about the partnerships and the products and so forth. So think about how, if you're a community partner, how can I use my my community partner, my academic partner, my health department partner to best advantage? And I frequently offer things like, we can write letters on letterhead for you in support of your activity or your legislative. Now, we're not supposed to do that, but my hero, Arnold Perkins, always says, don't ask permission, ask forgiveness. So I always use letterhead incorrectly, and then, a little slap on the hand, big deal. Anyway, think about what you can do as an academic partner. Okay, just finishing up with this case study quickly. They tried a lot of different things to get the changes that they wanted to see in Harlem. They had, at one point, a campaign where 10,000 people sent postcards to the head of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and the mayor didn't get anywhere. They crafted a series of recommendations for the mayor on strategies where you could just better enforce the laws that are already on the books. Laws against bus idling. Didn't get anywhere. More testimony, more briefings, and finally they went the distance and took part in a lawsuit. Now, McConaughey Pemba Nixon says that this can be risky and costly, it's certainly time-consuming, but it is a potent way to help make change. And if it gets to that, it is important to think about joining, in this case, a legal complaint. And they were very smart. They filed under the complaint against the Metropolitan Transit Authority under the U.S. Civil Rights Act, which, as you know, denies federal funding to any organization, any program that discriminates on the basis of race. They had clear evidence that there was racial discrimination in the location of all those bus depots, etc. And so that was their grounds. And while they didn't win the case outright, the judge used a lot of their language in the decision, and it subsequently helped chip away at some of these problem areas. Well, these are just some of the outcomes to which the MEAC partnership has made substantial contributions, things like getting the Metropolitan Transit Authority to convert the whole fleet to clean diesel. Now, some of us say that's a little bit like being a little bit pregnant. It's not quite where you want to be, but it's still a step forward. Getting EPA to set up those permanent air monitors all over the country in hotspots, that was a big thing. Tighter air quality standards, which have withstood all legal appeals, and there have been many. And then finally, New York's adoption of a state environmental justice policy. The co-chair was Peggy Shepard of Weed. So they have, I think, made real contributions. And here, 13 years after this initial study, they're still working on the signature issue, but also on things like indoor air pollution, climate justice, which is their big issue now. They're working very hard on the passage of new legislation to reduce greenhouse gases emissions by 80% by 2050. Now that is right now in process. We don't know how that's going to come out, but they're continuing to not only work on their initial issue, but move forward on new issues. Okay, sitting in the audience here is Susanna Hennessy Lavery, one of my greatest mentors in CVPR, and I don't know if your partners are here. Partners? Okay, they're not here yet. I asked Susanna if I could use an example of some work that she did earlier with Literacy for Environmental Justice, because she's going to be talking after this session on some of the current work being done in the Tenderloin in San Francisco and some other very exciting work in Bayview Hunters Point. And she said I could. She's so generous. She will maybe go over a little bit of this, but I'm going to just quickly use it as a second example, because this is a case where a community-based organization that really is youth-driven, worked with the health department, using money from tobacco to do something that wasn't entirely tobacco-related, something else we do without permission sometimes. But they basically did a survey, found that one of the top 2 or 3 issues in Bayview, Hunters Point, San Francisco, which we often associate with high homicide rate and a lot of air pollution, but one of the top issues was lack of access to healthy foods. They do not, at the time this work was done, there was no full-serve grocery store. And Susanna will talk about a community action model that she and her colleagues developed for training youth to do this kind of work. So I'm not going to mention that. I do want to mention that they did 4 different kinds of research that I could count, surveying 130 residents, interviewing merchants, interviewing residents, doing one thing I wanted to share with you, this store shelf diagramming. This is something we as adults can't do, but kids can do. They can walk into a store and say, excuse me, I have this assignment. Can I just do some measuring in your store? And what they did was they used, and this was developed by Alan Cheadle some time ago, this store shelf diagramming, where you go in and you measure how much shelf space is available for meat, for produce, for packaged food, alcohol and cigarettes, sodas, and so forth. And they put this all together, and it turned out that close to 40% of all the shelf space was going to packaged food, 26% to alcohol and cigarettes, 17% to other beverages, which you know are mostly sodas, and so forth, 2% for produce, and altogether 5% maybe to healthy foods. So really not a exciting, not very exciting finding in the wrong direction, but this is the 11 Bayview Hunter Point corner stores. Again, an area where people do not have access to a major supermarket. And they also did GIS mapping, and they talked to residents and discovered that it takes, if you were going to go to a full-serve grocery store, it would take 3 buses and 1 hour to get there. Many people don't have cars. And 25% of residents eat fast food daily. Well, surprise, surprise, there's lots of fast food, just not the healthy stuff. And the other point that Susanna and her colleagues make, especially the policymakers, is our community at that time, and this was some years ago, was taking $2 million every year out of the community to shop at a wealthier neighborhood that had a store, a grocery store. So they constructed policy alternatives. They reviewed different municipal ordinances. What are other cities doing about this? They wanted to craft one that would reflect local conditions. They wanted to see if there were existing laws, policies on the books that just needed to be enforced or maybe amended or revised for local use. And then they decided, let's do something more immediate. You know, people wanted to come up with an ordinance, and the policy mentor said, you know, just having an ordinance saying you have to offer more healthy food is not going to last. It's not going to have teeth. It's not going to be enforced. So do something that has a chance of success. And they developed this more immediate goal, which they called the Good Neighbor Program. And I always get some of these wrong, but basically they were giving incentives to stores, corner stores, that would devote at least 10% of their space to healthy food, reduce outdoor tobacco ads, lower the level of the ads so they're not at the level of a third grader, I believe. They had a wonderful, this is a policy mentor, former Supervisor Maxwell, who worked with them through this whole process, and it's really good to get a policymaker on board with you early on. They found all these other partners that would support this kind of a voluntary program, like the Office of the Environment, like the San Francisco Power Cooperative. And then they got an ad company to develop these ads for encouraging people to shop at the stores that are good neighbors, that are really trying to help you in your effort to improve your health. And one of these ads won an Addy campaign, so they really were very effective. And this is my poor attempt at showing you some of the outcomes, but this is the pilot store changes in sales of selected items as a percent of total sales. The first year, 2003, in the first 7 months, produce sales went from 5% to 15%. Alcohol sales dropped by 10%. Fall of 2008, a few years later, still produce up, alcohol down, cigarettes down, profits up. And even in fall of 2011, the last time I went down, the store manager was joking. He said, you know, our produce is now 17% of total sales. We got to get busy and start selling a little more alcohol. And he was kidding. But anyway, these are impressive outcomes. Now, just a quick question. Why would you guess the alcohol and cigarette sales were going down?
More families.
Okay, so there's not as much advertising of alcohol or cigarettes in particular, but what else, what change in who's going into the store might influence this? Families going in, grandma's going in, mom might be going in.
Those people that used to take the bus might be going in.
People who used to be taking the bus might be going in. Yeah, so but the big thing apparently was families, and particularly mom and grandma, who I don't want to see when I'm buying my alcohol and cigarettes. So, okay, this program expanded, and Susanna can tell you the details, but in fact, they were starting some other stores. Not all of them worked out. They had 5 more that were underway when the recession hit. This is a big reminder of the importance of context, because Ledge financially could not afford to continue with this program. They went on hiatus. Some with corner stores, there were no more conversions at this point, and a policy that they had worked hard for, getting a pilot program that could be tried in other parts of the state, was signed but without appropriations, and it died in 2011. So Mark Lennon was still very committed to trying to revitalize this and get it passed. In the meantime, great new things are going on in Bayview, and Susanna and her partners will tell you about them. Okay, one last case study. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. This is a model that you have. This is a very hard thing to see, but it's in your packet. A nice, cleaner, more recent version of a model that Nina and others worked hard on to help us look at the CBPR context, processes, policy, strategies, and outcomes. I was going to run through one quick example of a campaign that basically illustrated all of this. This is Old Town National City, once the heart of the Latino community in San Diego County. And in the 60s, an all-white legislature voted to make it a mixed-use neighborhood. All the paint, auto body stores moved in, all these industries that totally polluted. It just became a dumping ground. This is the local school, the pink triangle, and around it, all these unhealthy, polluting industries. Just a really bad situation. Truck driving school across the street from the elementary school, literally during school hours, used to have trucks back up into the schoolyard and practice idling and turning around and going out again. So it was just an atrocious situation. On the other hand, the context also included things like great environmental health coalition that had been around for decades, history of collaboration between that organization and several universities, and strong community and social networks through the church, the local school, and so forth. The getting evidence through policy, through research, in-house research. They had an MPH epidemiologist who did things like GIS mapping and did this nice map showing the footprint and how, if you're in Old Town proper, you're exposed to over 23,000 pounds per year of toxic air emissions compared to these other neighborhoods just a few blocks, a few footprints away. The university partnered in very important research that they could share with the community, and they also did data gathering for local communities on their particular exposure. The promotoras who work with the Environmental Health Coalition were trained to do peat tracking, to measure fine particulate matter, but also to do surveys with local residents to find out a whole, lot of things, including whether their kids had diagnosed asthma, and incidentally, this rate of 14% is exceedingly low because over about a third of these kids have mental health insurance. So nobody's been there to diagnose them. Most of them are at the local school where we know the rates are exceedingly high. But this survey was important because it also showed that a very high priority, the number one priority for residents was getting affordable housing, something the project team knew nothing about and could now take into account. The promotores were trained, they used this exercise, for example, to look at social determinants of health using roots, branches, and leaves of the tree. They were trained in power mapping and a lot of other areas in research. Go very quickly here, the church ministry, the school organization, the neighborhood council all work with the Environmental Health Coalition. Partnership dynamics were an issue, and it wasn't always good dynamics. Some of the community promotores, said they really were badgered by people in the community they got resentment from their husbands because they were out at night. And the head of this organization was an unattached male. They were badgered by older women, and the community said, "I've been here 30 years. If I can't change things, why do you think you can?" And they were called chismosas. Anybody? Chismosas? Gossips. Yeah. I mean, these poor women, they're doing their best. This guy is really remarkable. He became a law student at Cal, so he could go further on environmental justice work, but he at the time was heading the Environmental Health Coalition, and one of the things he did was take all the promotores' husbands out for beer. And basically in an informal atmosphere, let them know, look, I've got a girlfriend, I'm not hitting on your wife, and by the way, she's doing great work. You ought to come down to city council and listen next time she speaks. And, it was just a smart thing. Shouldn't be necessary, but it was. Okay, policy strategies, just very quickly, they did some very effective strategic planning, looked at a lot of different possibilities, came up with this amortization ordinance, the idea that you give businesses who are polluting a reasonable amount of time to shut down and get out of town, after which they can no longer work there. But more important, they decided to really target getting a specific plan that would take health and environmental justice into account and relocate those businesses, get them all out of town so they're no longer hurting people, and they put affordable housing into the strategic plan. This is just a picture of the policy mapping that they did, policy advocacy, media advocacy, and some of the outcomes. They did get that first ordinance. They became the first municipality in California to make environmental justice part of their general plan, and they did get that specific plan. So this community is changing rapidly, and the truck school is changing its practices. And then finally, I just put a few quotes from the promotores, but it's really wonderful to hear women tell you, I used to be very timid, and now I speak up, and I know my data, and I know what to say to the media. One of them, I love this one. She said, we go to city council meetings, and then I see the reports on TV with my kids, and they say, Mom, that isn't true what the city council members are saying. So the kids are getting educated along with the parents, and they're the next generation. I put this in just because it all goes back to context. One of the things that happens when you clean up communities is that they become ripe targets for gentrification. And Old Town is very concerned about this. How do we keep this land for the people who worked so hard to change it, to improve it, and so that they are not displaced? I don't have time to do an update on the Chinatown project, but I will show you this slide, the picture that wasn't seen yesterday of one of the young women workers who was honored at City Hall for her work in bringing about change. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about challenges in CVPR-focused policy, but maybe Nile could come forward, and then if you like, if we have time later, we can come back to the challenges. Okay? Thanks.
So good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Thank you, Meredith, for that amazing presentation about the context of CDPR, but also like the importance of community engagement and the relationship between the two. So my name is Malloy. I work with Community for a Better Environment. We're a statewide environmental health and justice organization, primarily working in low-income communities of color throughout California, in the Bay Area, Oakland and Richmond, and then also in Southern California, Southeast LA, Wilmington, mostly in the LA area. And we've been working on environmental justice issues because it's a very critical issue that's been bubbling up as we've been around for 30 years, really trying to draw the links between the problem and finding this kind of key solutions. And so we are a membership-based organization where we have members in all our key areas that have to help us cultivate strategies, planning, and even kind of, to some extent, lead the organization. So everyone know what EJ is. I hope this thing doesn't rapidly flow through this thing. So everybody know what EJ is. So it's kind of, a lot of us have been involved in terms of like even developing the principles of environmental justice back in the 1990s. And it's been a fundamental key principle in our kind of organizing and outreach, mainly because, no community should be just thrown away. No community should be left to carry the brunt and the burden of our society. CB, we focus on three things. I'm just giving you a little bit of context for the organization because when we look at CDPR in that context, it's kind of building out of already the campaigns and work that we've been doing. So we focus on three kind of strategies or prongs in our organization. One is community organizing. So a lot of you know what that is, but we do a lot of door knocking, outreach, activity development. We do a lot of this stuff with our membership, and we also co-develop key campaigns. And then the research and science, we have a couple of research and scientists that are working with us as well. Some of our programs are highlighted here. We've been doing leadership development, pollution prevention, et cetera, and then also kind of focusing on the cleanup and greening up our community strategies. So here's some little bit of images of kind of the communities that we've been working with, are visually seeing and have been seeing for decades. And so when they come to our membership meetings, they basically are raising a question about, so what's really happening? We are sick, I have asthma, I have a friend who has cancer. What can we actually do about it? Another example here in Wilmington, a couple sites, this particular home is one of our members actually lives there and has to deal with the brunt of trying to basically speak out against the refinery down there, but dealing with the challenges of opposition from not only the refinery, it's a kind of a refinery town, but also dealing with the opposition from her neighbors, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in terms of like what's really going on in some of these kind of communities. So in terms of our work, we've been looking at a broad stroke of kind of different approaches, but we're looking at stopping the worst and also kind of winning the solution that's really going to be most effective. And so when we ground CDPR, we really are grounded in the context of kind of the residents and the membership that we've been involved with. So to the top left, I guess that's, to the top left, we've been developing strategies, looking in Oakland in particular around the framework around green is good for our neighborhoods. And this is kind of a proactive framework that we've been looking at. We've also looking at issues of climate justice and knowing that for our experience, a lot of the frontline organizing that we've been doing has actually been cooling the planet, addressing climate change, and really kind of focus on the community health problems. Here's another image of our membership, the folks that I'm bringing up here, that are actually have been through CDPR training within our own kind of internal strategies, but also engaging with our academic partners. Here's another image of a rally where little kids said Chevron is bad for babies and other living things. So we're basically trying to make sure that the family is really engaged in this work and that there are strong links in how this will work out. So in terms of CDPR, I'm going to talk about two case studies or two different, sort of how the work was embedded in campaigns that we've been working on, both in Richmond and also in Oakland. So back in 2004, CB's really been working really closely with, a lot of people know these folks, Rachel Morella Frost from UC Berkeley, and also Manuel Pastore at USC, around a framework around community engagement and looking at what we already been doing and how to actually intersect with a broad strategy that academic partners really working on it. So if you look at these three prongs, CB does the outreach and engagement. We've done the public policy, the community training. We're doing that. So how can we actually get more value working with some of our strong academic partners, and what can actually provide in addition to what we're actually working on? And then the foundation, which a lot of you know, it takes funding, it takes resources, but it also takes the relationship building to make this happen. So Liberty Hill Foundation basically generously supported this project of looking at a framework around CDPR that actually are engaged with our kind of current work. So we've been looking at it from a few standpoints. Rachel Morella Frost personally worked on this with us, but this is pretty much looking at, we already know the community stressors. We see the diesel trucks, we see the unsafe neighborhoods, the noise pollution, the blighted lots. We also know that there's healthcare problems, the individual stressors of not having enough resources, even education levels. When we see in all our communities that, where are people at educationally and what they actually can do, that is a kind of a key individual stressor, how they can bring in income. And then across the bottom, these are the sources that we've identified that are continuously having a sore spot in the back of our communities, from industrial sources like refineries, to the chemicals that are emitted, to the indoor and outdoor exposure, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then the chemicals that are coming to our body. So all these different types of things, and where we frame it is around looking at cumulative health impacts, and we see it, people understand it, but it's not really interpreted in that way, like cumulative impact. So it's a real kind of connection. So in Richmond, we've been working, I'm gonna highlight Richmond primarily because we've been working in Richmond for over 2 decades, really looking at industrial pollution and really in Contra Costa in general, but primarily focusing on looking at refinery pollution and other kind of toxic facilities. And so in this particular project right here, we've received some funding from NIHS to look at an indoor-outdoor study around the kind of air contaminants in the community, as we know that they exist, but trying to quantify and create that data to help us move our campaign. The campaign we were working at specifically at the time was a Chevron refinery campaign, which basically focused on how can we ensure that the refinery can reduce as much emissions possibly. Also, how do we hold them accountable to the regional air district standards? And then also the other piece of that was trying to figure how can we get Chevron to actually do more innovation, use more best available control technologies, et cetera. So we basically, in our kind of campaign approach, we already knew that in this particular situation, before we started engaging in this project, that Chevron was in the process of expanding its refinery to process heavier crude oil. The refinery at the time, this was back in 2005 and 6, we already knew that basically this community was already burdened by toxic pollution, health problems, etc. And so we already knew that dirtier crude or heavier crude oil would have another additional burden, not only from the toxic emission side, from the benzenes and everything that comes out from the refinery, but also from the side of what the community wanted. The community wanted a different vision and did not want this expansion to happen. So we developed kind of key messages because around no dirty crude oil, looking at a clean vision, we helped kind of foster that. And then we started working on this household sampling study, which we worked with Rachel Morella Frost and UC Berkeley, and Silent Spring Institute, and Brown University, really looking at these kind of key issues around, so what actually is coming into our homes? And so we basically, since we're already doing organizing and outreach with our membership, we basically brought in our members and actually had a discussion before even the proposal process, and for us even kind of getting resources with NIHS, talking with our membership about what do they want, what do they envision, what kind of partnership can we establish or strengthen with our academic partners. So these are the things that they came up with. They wanted to do this indoor study to basically see what kind of contaminants are coming to their community. So we pretty much negotiated a lot of the kind of core language in the proposal to ensure that our community was engaged in that process to basically take ownership and even developing a proposal, giving feedback to the proposal, and actually simultaneously implement it once it hit the ground. So we trained, before I go to finance, we trained 10 people, basically from the study focused on 2 different areas. It focused on Richmond as one key area, but it also focused on Bolinas. Bolinas, how many people have been to Bolinas, California? All right, can somebody tell me what's the difference between Bolinas and Richmond? All right, money, different kind of environment, it doesn't have a major polluter, they do have some livestock and other kind of issues, but the key thing with that, we try to make sure that we had that balance. And so what we did is that we looked at 40 homes in Richmond, and then looked at 10 homes in Bolinas and kind of did some kind of comparison based on the indoor and outdoor results. So what we kind of quantified is that, you know, there was a lot of, from what we gathered, is that there was over 153 chemicals tested. More chemicals was in Richmond than Bolinas. 80 chemicals was from Richmond outdoor air, and then 104 chemicals came from Richmond indoor air. So in our work, we were talking about trying to figure out the air quality issues, but what it brought up is that there was other kind of concerns internally that was affecting these homes, you know, in terms of like old sofas that had very toxic chemicals, from the different kind of things that people use, the household products that people use. So we had to do a lot of different training around this in the process of gathering this data. So we had several different workshops focusing on household cleaning, and also how do you look at basically cleaning up your house to basically be able to live and breathe, and also understand the connection between what's in your home and what's coming in from air. So that was a very interesting exercise where we had, you know, several community meetings around it with our membership that it turned out there was 75 people at each membership meeting, which is kind of like our average membership meeting where we actually talked about this in levels of detail about what the chemicals were, how it affected you, and what you can actually do about it. This is also during the Chevron campaign process, was also during the same time of the city of Richmond going through a general plan process. So our members was actually engaged with 2 campaigns when this project was actually basically birthed and created. And so the general plan, as you know, cities going through general plans, they have a lot of different things that it maps out the future of the city. But one of the key things that the city, but we've discussed in our kind of these team meetings and using this data, is that we want to see stronger environmental justice policies in the whole general plan that actually can reduce pollution and also create kind of community benefits in terms of health, in terms of public transportation, in terms of the industrial pollution impacts, et cetera. So this data was used in 2 different ways. One, to use it to inform our members, to inform our allies, but also we use it to talk about it in the context of planning processes in the city. Planning processes that was happening with the general plan. So we brought some of this data and people highlighted their own personal impacts related to it. Some of the other outdoor air contaminants that came from this project, looking at some of the things that we looked at, kind of crude oil combustion. So vanadium and nickel was highly found in people's homes, which we were doing a correlation right now with this data that we were, like I said, we was in this refinery campaign around the Dirty Crude project being built, expanded in Richmond, that we was trying to make a point that toxic emissions as is already at a high level and it's causing problems. And this data further supported that, so how can we not do this with this future project? And then also we noticed that there's also traffic issues in Richmond and other, and it's a poor community as well. A lot of diesel trucks are coming back and forth in residential areas. So we had to address kind of the residential diesel impacts in the context of that work. And then looking at what comes out of diesel and other pollutants. It's also near a freeway, so there's a lot of toxins that's coming from the freeway traffic. So we try to make that connection between how things were actually coming into the air and impacting the community. So one thing that we value in our process is that some of our best strategies and policies and research approaches come from engaging our membership. So having monthly, weekly, even sometimes with big mobilization trainings or workshops, or even strategy sessions with our membership actually helps us to shape policy to make the wins real, and also give the community ownership of those policies. So the policy development was developed within our membership and with our allies. And so this kind of like some of that study is that basically what it actually entailed for us is that we can use the data from air contaminants coming from the community to really set a benchmark in terms of air quality issues that we want to see in the refineries development project, as well as in the general plan. So that was a win-win for us in terms of the partnership because it was timely in terms of how that relationship kind of built out. The other more recent project we did in 2007, 2008, because we've been working in these communities for a long time. We've also done work looking at a household survey, where we worked also with Brown University, Silent Spring Institute, and UC Berkeley academic partners on looking at a survey of like what's the community's priorities or concerns in relation to health, safety, air quality, etc. So we did this survey with over 198 participants, and we actually trained some of our members with some of our key leadership to actually go into the homes, have this long, extensive survey, deal with all the dynamics that it comes up with, like being surveyed, and where this data would be used, are you taking advantage of me? So we have to deal with all these kind of barriers, individual barriers to actually get into people's homes, and was able to deal with 198 homes. And we focused on Atchison Village and Liberty Village, and also the Iron Triangle area, which is actually adjacent to, or even parallel to, the refinery. And so what we saw in this this household survey is that there's multiple members with sicknesses, there's multiple members with issues that they really are most concerned about, but they really was focused on the refinery. They really had this history of this mammoth, project behind them, really not knowing what to do to mitigate it. And I'm not sure if anybody knows the context of Richmond, but basically, Chevron really has a stronghold on the whole infrastructure of the city. Even though they have a Green Party mayor, they have very clean solutions and things like that, maybe one of the biggest solar kind of visionaries in the Bay Area, but still they have a politically strong hold with Chevron. So when you get members really talking about how do we really address air quality issues, knowing that we know that the majority of the pollution is coming from this refinery, there's this, like, how do we do it? How do we figure it out? So we thought that the best way to move this forward with kind of the priorities that was coming from our membership and from this survey was to even dive a little bit deeper in terms of the refinery impacts. And so we started shopping this around with the Contra Costa County Public Health Department, meeting up with our planning commissioners. We met with the city council folks to basically say, like, how do we really look at the general plan process to reduce these problems? We already know that, similar to a lot of other communities, Richmond has, high asthma rates. I'm glad you mentioned the Harlem example, because Harlem has extremely more asthma impacts. But Richmond is really close to, or really higher than a lot of places in the Bay Area. And also looking at the state, is pretty up there in terms of like the asthma and respiratory impacts that are affecting young kids and families. And so we basically quantified this data from the survey, because a lot of folks actually revealed their health ailments, what their concerns were, what their problems were. And what was interesting from our membership that actually participated in the leadership and doing the outreach, they knew that folks were ill, or there was problems, or there was concerns, but didn't obviously know that there was a deeper connection to a broader strategy, to a bigger campaign, to a bigger policy push. So that was another kind of insight that came from that. So real quickly, knowing that I don't have a lot of time, some of the things that we built out is that, we, through this work and utilizing this data, we were able to prevent Chevron from expanding. But we used a couple of handles. We used the data that we collected in this research, we used our community campaigning muscle, and we also had to use our legal muscle. So we had to use a legal argument to actually get the refinery to not be constructed to be built. But it took the community engagement from the CDPR to get people really engaged about the health, the air quality concerns over years about these problems to really see that this was a momentous moment. And then we passed strong environmental justice and health policy in the general plan. So throughout the whole general plan, through all the different elements, there's strong EJ policy. And we didn't do that alone. We did it with the Richmond Equitable Development Initiative, which are several different environmental justice organizations, including Urban Habitat, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, West County Toxic Coalition, and others in Richmond, really trying to focus on these policies. And simultaneously, it built on the whole infrastructure around the TCE process. A lot of you know that the California Endowment has invested in 14 sites throughout the state of California. And we were really advocating based on utilizing our data that we collected with our academic partners and others to say you should fund the work here. We have one of the major pollution sources in the state of California. How do we look at cumulative health impacts here? We also simultaneously did some ground truth. So CBPR is kind of like, to be honest, for our membership, it's pretty much a tool for doing community engagement and community outreach, but it's also a tool to educate our membership. So we also did a lot of ground truthing in this Atchison Village area adjacent to this pollutant facility. And so we passed initially some land use and greenhouse gas emissions measures that was supposed to be in the Energy Climate Action Plan. So we passed some land use, kind of basically giving the city land use authority to mitigate local pollution. Because the way the state is set up, under climate issues around 8032, the Global Warming Solution Act in California, that refineries are separate. They don't have to deal with the local jurisdiction. So we were basically advocating for the local jurisdiction, Richmond, to take their own agency and basically hold polluters like refineries accountable to reducing their emissions locally, not just selling them to a broader market. We also use this data to help support the Community Choice Energy Program. So Richmond is one of the only communities in the state of California that is a majority or has a strong people of color demographic that actually is looking at clean energy as a strategy to look at mitigating pollution and also creating job creation. So we use this data about health, air quality, and building the case that this is advantageous for the city to look at this clean energy opportunity. So those are a few things that kind of resulted from different steps of looking at, one, the indoor-outdoor air quality study, and also looking at what we did in the health survey that kind of built up over a period of time to get these kind of victories. So the other case study is in Oakland. In Oakland is, we also work with Rachel Miller Frost and Manuel Pastor. Primarily, Oakland, we've been doing engagement in East Oakland for over 6 years, but we started off with a project to look at cumulative health impacts in this type corridor. We already knew that schools, public health agencies, our key members and residents already knew the issues. They knew we had high asthma rates. They saw the diesel trucks coming past their homes. They also saw that it was disproportionate between the land use, between what's happening in their community and what's happening in the Oakland Hills. If you look at the flatlands and what's happening in the hills. So there's already kind of a knowledgeable understanding of that. And so we dug a little deeper, and so we worked with the public health department as well, and kind of utilized this data about the asthma impacts, and also looking at, the African American in the flatlands lived 10 years less than the white person in the hills. So it had a strong EJ racial justice component, which kind of built up, looking at our leadership, Latino African Americans, really this is really an issue for us. So we really decided to go an extra level, basically doing this community impacts mapping study, taking a small chunk of area, and what we did, we identified sensitive receptors and hazards and throughout the community. And what we found out is that a lot of the things that we identified wasn't showing up in the air district, wasn't showing up on DTSC, Department of Toxic Control, wasn't showing up in a lot of the other EPA as well. And so when we used this information, we said, this is not making any sense. Why are we collecting this data, and why there's gaps in what you're collecting? So we already know that there's already a multitude of burden, and so we saw this connection. And so this mapping study, we actually took 15 to 20 folks, there's about 20 people total, but there are different iterations of people engaged. And we went around with GPS systems and mapped each of these sites. So it was a very interesting, I guess, project for folks because people are not used to the GPS or any that form of technology. But folks were really engaged in the process of really seeing how this can actually benefit what we've already been working on, what we were working towards, knowing that the air quality issue was real and having this data. So a lot of folks, we did several different trainings to prep with Rachel Miller Frost, prep our membership to really be engaged, and actually just help build our leaders as well. So when we took this to different agencies around the health impacts, we had this in our back pocket and needed to address it. We also identified that there was a lot of diesel truck pollution in the area. And so diesel trucks for us was a campaign that we identified after this process that a lot of our membership was really interested in to basically show that there was diesel trucks coming in the residential area, there was no signage, because there's an idling law that says trucks shouldn't idle. We know the health impacts around it. And so what we did, we actually did our own diesel truck count. So we had to designate different key sites throughout East Oakland and count the number of trucks that were coming through the community. So we had to identify the number of axles the truck had. Was it a port truck? Was it a UPS truck? What kind of different kind of trucks was it? And we quantified that data, and what we determined is that this data was really critical because the truck counting that happened throughout in West Oakland, which actually West Oakland had a similar process that happened a few years before, it wasn't being replicated throughout the city. So we had enough evidence for us to look at the diesel impacts from the mapping study that we did with Rachel to also looking at the diesel truck count, where we had our members and youth basically counting trucks. We basically identified that this was a key issue that needed to be addressed. And so we took it to our city council leadership, and basically the results of that is that cities don't really support community-based, I don't know, questionable. But as much as you put so much heart and soul, and EPA funded this project, you have this, we got funding for it. You put your heart and soul, you engage the community about it, and you present this evidence, they're like, okay, we need to do a study on top of your study. So what they end up doing is doing a study on top of our study. So for the last year and a half, we pushed the city to earmark $100,000 to go to a truck study that can basically not have a negative impact on this community. And basically rerouting trucks, maybe particularly setting up an ordinance, and also looking at enforcement as a key strategy for this. And so from this work and looking at diesel trucks and looking at the asphalt impacts, and also knowing that in the data that we collected, there's a higher PM 2.5 rate than it is in the hills, we basically quantify this information and help us move this process. And so the diesel truck, we created this diesel truck working group with the City of Oakland, the Air District, the Port of Oakland, different regional agencies, and also community-based organizations to go through this process of like, this is going to be critical, this is what we want. And so, we won this City of Oakland resource. We're working on this partner right now. We strengthen our partnerships with the city. We make cumulative impacts a real issue because it was foreseen as it wasn't, which I'm going to talk about briefly. Because this cumulative impact data was very useful in terms of looking at future projects that are coming to East Oakland, looking at land use, because basically the zoning regulations and land use policies are basically a free-for-all for more toxic pollution. So over the last year, looking at utilizing our cumulative health impacts, working with the Alameda Public Health Department, we actually are working on a project where in East Oakland there is a major crematorium that has the capacity to burn over 3,600 bodies per year. Now, crematoriums normally burn around 300 bodies a year. I'm not sure if everybody knows about Oakland, but Oakland is foreseen as a lot of violence. So when the community first heard that a major crematorium was coming in the community, they were in uproar. They were like, so they basically are waiting to kill our black and brown kids to send them to the crematorium so they can have like direct pipeline to burn our, So it was a visceral reaction. And so we had to look at, so what was the data? So we actually had to work with the Alabama Public Health Department to actually look at what are the potential impacts of this facility. So we've been working on this project to not have this facility built in the community, and are advocating for, we want better land use and zoning regulations for the community to reduce future pollution and future projects. Because I'm not sure if you know about the environmental justice community, that for history, for decades, we've been fighting project after project after project after project, and there's been amazing successes. But at the same time, you think about, we don't have the resources or the luxury to do all these different projects at the same time. So for cities to really pivot themselves to look at zoning and land use policy to green these communities will be a win-win for our constituencies and a win-win for EJ. So that's kind of way that we've been pivoting, looking at building off this community impacts work, looking at the diesel truck work, and looking at some of these studies of our engaging our membership to hopefully prevent future projects for contaminated communities. One last thing that I want to highlight is that we're part of the California Justice Environmental Alliance, and there's 6 organizations that are highlighted here, and these organizations also been working with you hear a theme here, and also Manuel Pastor around looking at how do we look at statewide land use and decision making that actually can benefit communities of color or EJ communities. So all these different pop-up bullets are basically the communities where CB is organizing, but some of our allies are organizing, and we've been working on a statewide initiative to look at some screening methodology that can actually ensure that when projects or resources or anything is coming to these communities, there's some kind of methodology that can be unified or can be agreed upon that doesn't have an adverse negative impact. So in all these communities, we did ground truth. We did right in the hotspots, we call them hotspot communities too. We basically took a core group of our membership and basically in Richmond and Oakland, CD took over 25 of our members and actually mapped the community, used our GPA systems, and worked in partnership with our academic partners and developed these maps of toxic facilities similar to this one here for each of these communities. And what we identified is that there are these negative impacts, there's increased health burden, there's a number of toxic facilities, the sensitive receptors in terms of schools were in close proximity to these facilities and other areas. There were not enough buffer zones between these sensitive receptors, et cetera. And so what it created for us is an opportunity to work in a statewide alliance to really push the EPA around this policy. And so for the last year and a half, we've been working on looking at green zones, looking at this methodology, environmental justice screening methodology, to really kind of advocate for future climate funding, because a lot of us have been working on, AB 32, cap and trade funds supposed to go to communities that are most impacted, but there's no methodology for that criteria. There's limited criteria. So we've been advocating on the state level to ensure that there's strong criteria and screening methodology to benefit this. So it's now the first version of this environmental justice screening tool right now. You can actually go to the Cal Environmental Screen, which is actually a tool that you can go on the EPA website and other sites with different agencies, showing that there are clear indications or connections with toxic contaminants, and that we strongly need some kind of methodology to reduce this pollution. So this tool is really a tool that we see as a valuable tool to link the state, regional, and also other agencies to adopt and support. My interest in it has been mostly, from my standpoint, that we've been working really closely with EPA. That working with EPA is, it's a circle. You work great sometimes, and you don't work great, and you have to challenge them on different things. But I think the key thing about the environmental screen and what we kind of negotiated as kind of mutual benefits is that it really had a voice. EJ communities were at the decision-making table with other folks. EJ communities' priorities and interests was involved in the process, so that was really critical. And that this is something that we can see living out in to keep working out. So finally, just one thing I want to kind of close with is that, you know, a lot of our relationships with academic partners have been, you know, to some degree manageable, you know, in terms of like, you know, we have mutual interests, but there's always this issue around equity. And one thing is around resource allocation. So for folks that are thinking about doing CDPR, we have to really address the issue between the percentages of resources that is going towards the community and what's going to our academic partners. What we see is that in our work, it's been a good kind of negotiation, but it's been also a challenge because when our academic partners and others submit proposals, they earmark the community groups for, you know, a little bit of resources, and then we have to resource it through other means. And so we strategically have been working on making sure when we submit proposals to NIHS, to any kind of foundation or whatever, that we both are on the ground floor for the proposal development, and that it's really critical to build that up because sometimes gaps are missing. And then the last thing is that I'm glad that was mentioned earlier is that it's really critical for the academic partners to play a role in the policy development, but also in the implementation of development, because that is always a gap. There's strong partnerships, academic partners, there's books, there's scholarly documents, there's all these different kind of things, but then there's a gap between how does that information live in the community, which is like the community organization's responsibility, and also how does that involvement keep going and being engaged over time. So I just want to close with that, and I just want to thank you for your time.
So, you know, as you can see, passion keeps people working and has so many projects to contribute. I don't know, we have a few minutes for questions. We actually have a youth panel coming up in a few minutes. So, but, you know, questions around challenges to either of them or any others. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you both for the presentation. I was interested in the fact that each of you mentioned cases where an outside groups came in to kind of archive the research that was done on the ground, so you know, maybe either EPA or the city. So I'm just wondering if each of you have had to talk a little bit about experiences maybe where you've worked with academic partners where the academic findings weren't sort of academically robust to support either the concerns of the community or the issues that the organization was trying to advance, and how did you sort of deal with that or negotiate that?
Oh, testing. I mean, just real quickly, I think for me, for our organization, I was really mentioning towards the end is that those negotiations happen from the front end, the academic partners. I mean, everyone's committed, obviously, to finding a solution. But I think that's what's really critical is really kind of honing in on that in the front end versus the back end. So we basically did a lot of kind of internal negotiations with our academic partners on future projects, even though they have their goals and they already got the proposal money, but like when it actually is implemented, how do we really negotiate those pieces? So I think that happens on the front end, and that's what we've seen as a good option. But it's always, you know, it's a process.
Yeah, I would just add, and I should have skipped the last example because Nile's had so many good examples of environmental justice research. But in that last one I gave, you know, you might have noticed the survey was only of 119 people. It wasn't a randomized survey. But the fact is when you combine that with the stories of community residents, with the GIS mapping, with the evidence from USC that's very strong, it's one piece of a larger picture. And that's, I think, where we need to get to when we don't have the strongest, most rigorous possible research.
And I just want to emphasize that one of their colleagues, Jason Corbett, has coined the term street science, that there's a role for science from the street, from youth, from residents of small samples, which is combined with testimony, and there's a role for larger epidemiologic studies that prove the effects of environmental contaminants on asthma rates. So all of this together is needed by community-based organizations such as CPD to to really create strong advocacy, and the examples that Meredith gave as well. So it isn't one thing, but I like this term street science because it allows us to think what can happen in the street, and how do you combine that with solid academic partners and epidemiologic studies that you also get involved in. So you get involved in both. One or two more questions, yeah.
Is it, just as a follow-up to that though, is it possible as a next step to be able to do some type of study that has like a comparison group, or I mean, maybe not randomized, but I mean, how do you move that to the next step?
Yeah, there are some people, UCLA right now is doing a major community depression study among African Americans with Healthy African American Families, which is the lead organization. It is a randomized controlled trial. Some of us, have worries about randomized controlled trials when you're doing CDPR, but I think there's increasingly rigorous research being done, including research where the community is there from the beginning, and ideally, as Nile said, sitting down at the table and helping before any grant ever gets submitted. The other quick thing I was going to say was one of the advantages of the community doing the science is that they come up with things that are politically going to be very powerful. The example I gave in Old Town National City, the community residents who learned to do pee tracking, which is a very effective tool for measuring pollution exposure, said let's use City Hall as our control site. So they were able to show their exposure compared to that of City Hall. Not the highest science in the world, but certainly politically important.
Yeah, I had a question. Meredith, in one of the case studies, I think there was a national city, and you kind of mentioned sort of briefly that once the conditions were improved, then that actually created a new pressure around gentrification. And I wondered if you had anything more to say about community strategies for resisting gentrification.
I don't know if Susanna in her session will talk about this, but it is a huge problem. And we do need to be working with policy mentors and policy friends from the beginning to ensure that the improvements that communities help to bring about don't end up, shooting themselves in the foot.
If you look at just Oakland, for example, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Buying a house or anything right now, $400,000 or $500,000, and these increases. So I think people are being pushed out. Just the market itself. So I think there's strategies. There's different campaigns are looking at homes for all. So campaigns are looking at those issues of like challenging gentrification, bringing people back to the communities, or maintaining. So there's campaigns afoot. The question is, we just got to keep working hard to make sure it doesn't happen.
I think the major lesson is that the science is not independent from campaigns. The science is with the campaigns in terms of CDPR for whatever issue that's core to your hearts or to all of our hearts. And so that's a really strong message from this morning. I guess, Anthony, I know you had one last. Okay, so we have welcome to all of you who have joined us today. Where did Antwi, is he back there? Hi. How are you?
Good.
But I don't know if you want to stand up and just stretch a minute while the young people get their come up and figure out. Don't go